Order, order. Graham Morris to move the motion.
I beg to move that this House has considered the motion economic disparities in older industrial areas.
The question is, this House has considered economic disparities in older industrial areas. Graham Morris.
Thank you, Mr. Rosindell, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship for the first time in this session in the new Parliament. I would like to take the opportunity to thank the Chairman of Ways and Means, who I understand has allocated the time for this debate, which I think is a very important one and is significant not just to my constituents and some of the older industrial areas in England, but also in Scotland and in Wales. I would like to point out, Mr. Rosindell, that older industrial areas make up a substantial part of Britain. On the definition used in the report, to which I intend to refer extensively, 96 of the districts in England, Scotland and Wales account for 30% of the population of Great Britain, and these areas have been hard hit by many years of job losses. I would like to place on record my thanks to the Industrial Communities Alliance for helping me to prepare for today's debate, and for their very informative report, Whose Recovery?, which indicates how the upturn in economic growth is leaving older industrial areas behind. I'd also like to draw the Minister's attention both to the report and to Early Day Motion 171, Industrial Communities Alliance report on the economic disparities in older industrial areas, which was only tabled yesterday and has already attracted over 30 signatures. The report provides an insight into the challenges faced by former industrial communities in the English regions in Scotland and in Wales. And the report shows that the economic gap between London and the former industrial communities continues to widen, not only during difficult economic periods that we experienced after the global financial crash in 2008, but also throughout the recession, and even today as the UK returns to modest growth. So I do hope that during the course of today's debate that the Minister will also provide more details regarding the Northern Powerhouse initiative, which is of particular interest to my constituents. And in particular, will the Northern Powerhouse be tasked with reducing the immense economic disparities between the North East and London and the South East? Whilst I welcome the intent from the Prime Minister and the Chancellor about creating a Northern Powerhouse, I must point out that good intentions won't get us very far. We need the political rhetoric to be translated into practical policies and indeed targeted support for the poorest regional economies. Personally, my view is that we need a strong voice in Cabinet advocating for our regions. I fear that that is missing when I read about comments from newly appointed ministers like the Secretary of State for Local Government, who questions the existence of the widening economic inequalities between the regions and London. The evidence is absolutely clear and presented very concisely in the report that I've referred to. So I believe the first step in the road to recovery is to acknowledge that there is a problem. I think it's been evident in relation to the lack of support for my area, particularly Durham County Council, my local authority, in the lack of support they've received from the Department for Communities and Local Government. I don't think the rhetoric of the Northern Powerhouse has been reflected in their budget allocations. Their budget has been cut by £250 million, £250 million, which is 40% of their total budget. I know that's mirrored in other local authorities where there are huge pressures and areas in Scotland, Wales and in England, older industrial areas are experiencing similar problems. And this is despite the fact that Durham County Council are providing services and support to some of the most deprived communities in the country, including some in my own constituency of Easington. But this lack of support isn't just in terms of budget cuts. The recently published County Durham plan outlined some ambitious targets to create 30,000 new jobs build 31,000 new homes and create 500 hectares of space for business, warehouses and office developments by 2030. And indeed, the scope of Durham County Council's ambition had been welcomed by the local business community, and it's certainly welcomed by myself as we seek to promote economic development and prosperity in my constituency and throughout County Durham and the North East. However, I must report, Mr Rosindell, the plan was dismissed by the Planning Inspectorate for being too ambitious. And despite our best efforts, ministers refused to intervene to support these bold proposals. And indeed, we did have a debate in this very chamber, Mr Rosindell, in the last Parliament. And it wasn't until Durham County Council filed legal papers with the High Court for a judicial review until the government listened and became involved in the issue. And my understanding presently, and perhaps the Minister might be able to give an update, is that there's a 30-day stay to court proceedings. But I am disappointed that the only way it seems to get the government to engage in economic development plans in County Durham was to seek legal redress, which could have been avoided altogether had the Minister been more forthcoming when we originally discussed this matter in the Westminster Hall on the 3rd of March. Returning to the report by the Industrial Communities Alliance, whose recovery, it found that the economic upturn since the recession had been weaker in Britain's older industrial areas, much weaker than in London and the South East. Whereas the number of jobs in London and the South East was 540,000 higher at the end of 2013 compared with 2009. In the older industrial areas, employment was actually 70,000 lower. The rate of growth in private sector employment in older industrial Britain during this period was 1/10 of the rate in London and the South East. I often think, Mr Rosindell, when I'm sitting in the chamber and listening to particularly members from the government benches reciting the levels of economic success in private sector employment, that really isn't reflected in the area that I represent, or indeed in many of the older industrial areas. And part of the purpose of this debate is to draw these inequalities and these problems to the attention of government and to hold them up to account and to seek some redress. So while employment between 2010 and 2014 in older industrial areas rose by 230,000, which is 2.9%, over the same period, employment in London and the South East rose by 440,000, 5.8%. And when we look a little deeper at the figures, not only is there a widening gap between the total number of jobs, but there's also a high reliance on part-time work in the older industrial areas. In London and the South East, virtually all the growth since 2010 had been in full-time employment. In contrast, in areas like mine, in the older industrial areas, 1/5 of the increase had been in part-time jobs. In London and the South East, the ratio between new full-time and part-time jobs is 16:1. In areas like mine, in the older industrial areas in Britain, the ratio is just 4:1. It's a considerable difference. Another feature, Mr Rosindell, of job growth in older industrial areas has been the rapid rise in the number of people who are self-employed, which accounted for almost 40% of the increase in employment in older industrial areas. Now, an impartial observer might think that's a good thing, but I want to try and drill down into this. With rising levels of self-employment, it can be an indication of a vibrant economy, but it can also mask fundamental weaknesses in the labour market. And this seems to have been confirmed by the evidence, Mr Rosindell, gathered by the Department for Business, Innovation and Skills, whose self-employment evidence-based found that in the South, a higher proportion of the self-employed are in professional and higher skilled occupations, whereas in much of the rest of the country, particularly in the older industrial areas, more of the self-employment is in areas of elementary or low skill occupations. I'm concerned that self-employment in older industrial areas, along with the expansion of zero-hours contracts, is in fact creating a low-wage, insecure economy, which is leading to the further casualisation of the labour market in such older industrial communities. The disparity in regional economies are deep-rooted. In the IPPR North report, Northern Prosperity is National Prosperity, that was the title of the report, and the IPPR noted that regional inequalities date back nearly 150 years. So this isn't a new phenomenon. But despite some narrowing of the disparities between North and South in the post-war period, since 1985 the UK has had a higher rate of regional divergence than France, Germany, Italy and even the United States. So in essence what they're suggesting there, Mr. Rosindell, is far from addressing these regional inequalities and disparities, as they have in many of our competitor countries, both within the EU and in the United States. It's actually getting worse in the United Kingdom. We've allowed the North and South to pull apart, and we should all be concerned about this, because this has led to a loss not only in economic terms, but in respect of the life chances which have been denied to people in the poorest economies in terms of education, health and income. And I'd also like to point out respectfully to the Minister and to the Government that there's also an impact in London and the South East in terms of quality of life due to overcrowding and congestion. So addressing the regional economic gap would have significant benefits for the national economy. Halving the gap between the North and the national average would increase national economic output by £41 billion. So if we are to achieve these gains, we need some real commitments from the government. However, there is currently, this commitment is lacking, and I would like to just quote some figures on transport investment, Mr. Rosindell, if I may, which really highlight the problems that we're facing. IPPR North found a huge disparity between infrastructure spending in London and the North East, and figures show that London receives £5,426 per resident in capital investment, and that compares with just £223 per resident in the North East, in my region. And indeed, a single project, Crossrail, is earmarked to receive 9 times more funding than all of the rail projects in the North's 3 regions combined. We are told of the benefits and the economic importance of projects such as HS2, but in reality, I suspect these will have little impact on vast areas of the North. The North East has been entirely overlooked, with the line ending at Leeds. And, you know, with all due respect, Mr. Rosindell, many of us who live in the real North believe that Leeds is actually the Midlands. And we think that HS2 will offer little practical benefit to the North East, and in particular to my constituency. In fact, potentially it may have the opposite effect. A Network Rail consultation document suggested the benefits to my constituents would be to cut journey times from Durham to London by just 11 minutes by 2033, at a loss of direct services to the capital and slower journey times to major Scottish cities, and at a cost ranging from 50 to 80 billion pounds. There are few policies that cost so much but deliver so little to my community. A tiny shift in spending to constituencies like mine in East Durham would have a transformative impact on our transport infrastructure as we seek to achieve our aim to improve connectivity to major lines and increase rail services. In my own constituency, I continue to work towards a new rail stop, a new station at Horden on the Seaview site. However, if the government had shown the same level of commitment to my area as they do in London, maybe I should be pressing for an integrated public transport system, an extension of the Tyne-Wear Metro, and improvements to our bus network, therefore expanding access to a wider labour market for residents. So there would be huge economic benefits to the area locally and to the economy. Another matter of great importance in my constituency is housing. I know that other members wish to speak in the debate, so I'm going to kind of shorten the passage on housing, but the villages and towns which make up my constituency were established specifically for the purpose of serving the local collieries. Mine was a coal mining area. The mines have now gone, but the investment to transform and redevelop the local communities has not followed. And this is as true in terms of infrastructure spending on transport and economic development as it is in terms of housing. And these issues have recently come to a head in the villages of Horden and Blackhall, following a series of problems being experienced by Accent Homes, a registered social landlord, that have properties in these villages, and indeed was the subject of a separate adjournment debate just before, in the old Parliament, just before Parliament was dissolved. Accent Housing have cited the following, that the introduction of the bedroom tax had resulted in a reduction in demand for their properties, and as tenants vacated their Accent properties, the housing associations decided not to let them, but to board them up. And it's soul destroying watching your own community suffer. And I would invite the Minister or any of her colleagues to visit Horden and Blackhall and see it firsthand, the situation in the numbered streets as these properties fall into decay and disrepair. Many former tenants have vacated the area and homeowners are trapped. They're unable to sell their property and there's no demand. And they have to live in streets with boarded up properties which are the target for antisocial behaviour, vandalism and crime. And indeed this situation is replicated elsewhere in the constituency, particularly in areas where private landlords have bought up properties at low cost and are seeking a return, mostly at the taxpayer's expense, funded through the housing benefit system. I know local residents don't accept the situation, and I would like to commend the work of the Horden Residents Association, who have been engaged in meetings and discussions with the Accent Housing, with the Homes and Communities agencies, with the Coalfield Regeneration Trust, and other private and public sector partners and agencies in order to try and find a way forward. And I know that the local councillors don't accept the situation, but the cuts to local authority budgets and the lack of any national housing regeneration fund is holding back the redevelopment of East Durham. This is disappointing, particularly given the level of funding which is available, but which seems to be diverted almost exclusively towards London and the South East. The potential for development in older industrial areas, including my own in the North East, is immense, particularly when considering that the properties I'd referred to are located in an area of immense natural beauty, bordering the award-winning East Durham Heritage Coast, a newly declared nature reserve, and tracking alongside one of the first stretches of the England coastal footpath. These areas of natural beauty are at the forefront of our efforts to promote leisure and tourism on the East Durham Heritage Coast, but the Minister must accept that these efforts will continue to be hampered due to the deteriorating situation in the villages. Poor, derelict housing will also undermine our efforts to bring forward economic development, which is the only way to create jobs, and we need to ensure that local people have the skills and the training, and those who acquire those skills and training are not forced to move away from the region in order to find work. My argument is, Mr. Rosindell, that we need to deliver a complete package in terms of housing, transport investment and education if we are going to attract new business and industries which will sustain our communities in the future and bring forward the economic development which is required if we are going to narrow the wealth gap between the regions and London. We need the redistribution of economic activity to provide new purpose for communities like those I represent in East Durham, which over the last 30 years have lost their core industry. We have had some recent successes, and just last weekend I was delighted to be at the groundbreaking at a ceremony that was held to mark the start of work on Dalton Park Phase 2, which is a £45 million investment that we hope is going to deliver up to 1,000 new jobs in my constituency, 500 during the construction phase. It'll provide new retail and leisure facilities, which will be very much welcomed in East Durham and in the wider region after nearly 2 decades of campaigning by the local community, supported by the local council, to secure this investment. However, we also need greater economic diversification in East Durham, and to grasp all of the opportunities which are available, we need new industries that will sustain my constituency in the future. And in my constituency, again, there is a rare opportunity to secure some significant private sector investment with the proposed Centre of Creative Excellence to be built on the East Durham Heritage Coast. This project would deliver over £200 million of private sector investment and could create 2,000 jobs and training opportunities in a ready-made global film and media communications market. The project had been receiving support from our regional development agency, One North East, prior to its abolition, and I have sought to raise the importance of this project with ministers in the previous Parliament. However, I'm afraid I've received little support, at least from the government side. In view of the government's new conversion to a northern powerhouse, I would welcome the minister's input into the direct support that they are prepared to offer to this unique and potentially transformative project in my constituency. Unfortunately, I'm yet to witness the positive impact of the local enterprise partnership, the government's other flagship policy, which is designed to support development and businesses, the Regional Growth Fund. I've always felt was a misleading term. The fund should be named a National Growth Fund. It's open to all regions, and to my mind, the proof of its failure is the widening economic disparities between the various regions, particularly between the older industrial regions and London and the South East, which is why I would advocate direct intervention from government in respect of the Centre of Creative Excellence. I believe if the Northern Powerhouse is anything other than rhetoric, we need a real development fund specifically targeted towards the weaker regional economies that will bring forward developments like the one in my constituency that I've just mentioned, that would address the employment and skills imbalance between the regions. And I believe there's a moral duty on government to close the gap and address regional inequalities, which is damaging to our national economy and leaving generations of people in the poorest economies behind and reducing their own life chances. There are opportunities for development if the government wants to seize them. The modest return to growth that we've seen so far in the last quarter has not been a recovery for all. In the older industrial communities, the recovery is in fact reinforcing the existing economic divides. If we are to rebalance the economy and deliver a sustainable recovery, the government needs to back up the rhetoric. We need to ensure the same level of resources and development which are being directed towards London and the South East are targeted towards the weakest regional economies. If we deliver these practical policies, there is an opportunity to narrow the economic gap and deliver much needed jobs and growth to former industrial communities, which for too long have been ignored by the government. I think there's a number of practical suggestions that I've put forward that I do hope the Minister will reflect on. And there are some opportunities here to take forward the government's vision of a northern powerhouse in some practical, meaningful terms that would benefit the region. And I'd be very interested in the Minister's comments in relation to those proposals.
Alison Thewlis.
Thank you very much, Mr Chairman, and thank you also to the Honourable Member for Easington for bringing this very important debate about economic disparities in older industrial areas. I represent Glasgow Central, which has within it several older industrial areas, which also bound on to other areas within Glasgow and within South Lanarkshire, which have a huge industrial legacy. And with that legacy, real issues with contaminated land, with vacant and derelict land, with issues that have been long-standing and prevent other economic initiatives taking place and investment from private capital, because the cost of cleaning up this land is absolutely astronomical. I'd like to mention that within my area is the Clyde Gateway Urban Regeneration Company, which covers Glasgow and South Lanarkshire and is a partnership with Scottish Enterprise and with the Scottish Government. And in the past 7 years since they've been established, Clyde Gateway have decontaminated and made ready for use 200 hectares of previously derelict and contaminated land, some of which has been derelict for 50 years and provides a serious blight on the area, without which anything else, nothing else can happen. They found in examining this derelict land that it was contaminated with things like chromium, which are hugely toxic, and they had to work and develop techniques to extract that chromium from the land before they can do anything with it at all. In other areas, there was parts of my constituency which had power stations on them, and when those power stations were taken out of production, they were just demolished. The land was not cleared, the land was not made ready. When Clyde Gateway's contractors went in to examine that land, they found sluices, they found underground works, they found all kinds of things, and that no private industry could ever have taken on the costs of cleaning that up. So therefore it falls to agencies like Clyde Gateway, to local authorities and to government to actually invest in that land and to make it ready for use so that jobs can be brought into the area. Unless you tackle those long-standing issues within communities, nothing else can happen. And this is true of my own area, it's true of lots of parts of post-industrial Scotland as well. The area that Ravenscraig Steelworks used to stand on in Motherwell also has had serious contamination issues to deal with before anything else can take place. Clyde Gateway have managed to, in doing this over the past 7 years, have managed to secure, to bring into the area £100 million of public and private investment to the area, to bring in jobs, to bring in other investment. They've created 40,000 square metres of business space within the east end of Glasgow and Rutherglen, which is absolutely amazing, bringing in that level of investment and that level of jobs. But this is the key thing, though. It has to be seen as an investment, all of this work in post-industrial communities, because if you don't invest, then, quite frankly, nothing will happen, and that neglect will continue. In Scotland, we have the Scottish Vacant and Derelict Land Survey, which collects data on the levels of vacant and derelict land. And within Scotland, the latest figures showed there was 10,874 hectares of vacant and derelict land, some of that in cities, some of that in more rural settings. And this causes a serious issue for those communities and for people in those communities, because they can't actually, there are no means of dealing with that in a lot of cases. It's such a huge problem of a post-industrial legacy, and there needs to be serious investment to overcome that. We also have the Scottish Government Regeneration Capital Grant Fund, which works with local communities to see what would they like to see in their areas, what projects can come on to invest, to bring new life, to bring new jobs into industrial areas. And that's been a real success as well. And the fund is very, very popular and very quickly oversubscribed. It's an annual budget of just £25 million, but is very, very popular and is already supporting 22 projects in Scotland across the country, and I think that's absolutely the right way to go down things, to say to local communities, what would you like to see and how can we help? In my own ward, in my own constituency rather, there have been such changes over time as well in the fabric of the area, and I say fabric with some reference to even the street names in the former industries. There you've got Muslin Street and Cotton Street. There were dye works. There was the famous Templeton's carpet factory within the area. All of those heavy industries have now gone, and where they stood, some of the areas have been filled in with housing, and some of them yet lie empty to be dealt with, and those industries have not been without leaving their scars. We also have a more positive thing coming forward in the Glasgow and Clyde Valley area with the City Deal, which was negotiated with the local authorities, the Scottish Government and the UK Government under the previous administration. And that has the potential also to bring huge benefits to the area, with local authorities working together across these boundaries, across these areas which bear the scars of heavy industry in the past. And I think that, again, is the right way to go, to collaborate, to find ways of working together to deal with these long-standing issues. Because for a lot of people, looking at it from the outside, they just see derelict land, they don't see what's underneath it, and the investment needs to be there to create the jobs to overcome those barriers. It's not just as simple as saying it's a post-industrial area, throw some money at it. It's making the land ready for use both by private and public industry, and a huge amount of money to invest into holes in the ground, but it absolutely has to be done before these areas can move forward. So I just want to thank the member for bringing this debate. I think it's very important, and I think we should all learn from each other, learn what's going on in different areas and what we can take back to our own constituencies to tackle these long-standing issues. Thank you very much.
Louise Haigh.
Thank you, Mr Rosindell, and I do apologise again for being slightly late to the debate, but it's a great privilege to serve under your chairmanship. And can I add my thanks to my honourable friend for Easington for securing this debate. He's done so much over the years to champion communities who have suffered decades of neglect and decline. And can I add my congratulations as well to the Industrial Communities Alliance, who have published an excellent report. Mr Rosindell, in my brief speech, I want to share some experiences from my own neck of the woods in Sheffield, a beautiful city with a thriving cultural and music scene, a proud sporting heritage and a strong sense of our own history, both industrially and politically. But members will, I'm sure, see similarities in my city and the ongoing challenges we face across all former industrial communities. It is a pattern that is all too familiar. Much was done in the 1980s to undermine the skill and to extinguish the expertise which working class men and women from my city had built up over centuries. Those working class men and women of my city led the world in forging steel, unmatched in brute strength and unrivalled in craft. Pockets of that skill still remain in Sheffield, where companies and governments from across the globe still flock to Sheffield forge masters in search of the very best there is. 31,000 people are still employed in manufacturing in my city, in no small part thanks to the fantastic and ongoing work of the former member for Sheffield Central, Richard Cabourn, and the Advanced Manufacturing Research Centre. But there is no doubt that we are still scarred by the legacy of Thatcher in not only my community, but as we have heard, in communities across whole swathes of our country. The legacy of that government and its most misguided industrial strategy still casts a dark shadow. What has become known in sanitised management speak as deindustrialisation is actually shorthand for a whole set of complex issues, as we have heard, which my community faces to this day. Generations of families relied on the manufacturing base of Sheffield to make a living. Generally, it was well-paid, long-term and skilled work. But the legacy of this decline has meant those jobs have been largely replaced with low-paid work, if there is work at all. And the figures bear this out. Wages have flatlined over 3 decades for all but the super-rich, and the number of people working in low-paid work, barely able to afford the basis, has risen from 13% in the late 1970s to 21% today. Even more alarmingly, the number of people who may not be low-paid now, but who have experienced low pay in the past 4 years, is at a shocking 33%, some 8 million people. That is the living, breathing legacy of industrial decline. This is what we mean when we talk about insecure work and low pay, and it's why we will continue to raise it time and time again on the Labour benches in this place and outside of it. But at the heart of this debate, Mr Rosindell, is a debate about the makeup of our economy. The report by the Industrial Communities Alliance rightly highlights that London and the South East has pulled away from the rest of the country, not just in this recovery, but in the past 3 decades. The trend towards deindustrialisation has been hand in hand with the financialisation of our economy, which began with the deregulation of our financial system, the consequences of which we witnessed only too really in the 2008 crash. And our communities, hit once in the 1980s, were forced to pay the price all over again. And this will continue to happen unless we fundamentally reform our economy, tackling the short-termist, risk-taking culture that continues apace in the City of London and Canary Wharf, and redirecting investment towards the productive, high-skilled and green industries that we need in order to secure a sustainable future. Put simply, the short-termism of our economic system is a major factor in the failure of many of our communities to recover, as capital is driven towards sectors and activities that provide an immediate return, rather than those that can build up jobs, productivity and growth in the long term. And because of this, we have a recovery which is anything but shared. For all the talk of a jobs miracle, in Sheffield there are still 6,000 fewer people in work than just before the crash. The government have unfortunately learnt nothing, and they seem determined to repeat the mistakes of the past, mistakes which we admit the last Labour government made in failing to draw in the financial system and rebalance our economy. And finally, Mr Rosindell, we cannot have this discussion apart from the ongoing debate around devolution. The government's much vaunted strategy of pursuing a northern powerhouse, however welcome, should not be simplified just to a focus on the great cities of Leeds and Manchester. If investment does not reach Sheffield and Copeland, Barnsley and Falkirk, then it cannot possibly be a success. Only today we have seen the government abandon its plans to electrify the Midland Main Line linking London to Sheffield, which will be incredibly disappointing for small businesses in my region. And I welcome the findings in the Industrial Communities Alliance report about the need for government to put forward resources and tax breaks to encourage investment in manufacturing, research and development across older industrial communities. It is something I and colleagues in Sheffield have been talking about for some time. What is evident is a real determination from this debate to put an end to 3 decades of economic illiteracy, which has seen inequality rise and opportunity stifled in communities across our country. Where financial services continue to enjoy a boom, a rich seam of opportunity is overlooked in our older industrial communities, which many members here represent. We need a strategy fit for the 21st century, and I believe this debate would be a good place to start. Thank you.
Christina Rees.
Thank you, Mr. Rosindell. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and may I thank the honourable member for Easingdon for securing this important debate. I'm pleased to have the opportunity to speak on this matter, which is of paramount importance to my constituents in Neath, a truly beautiful part of Wales. The Neath constituency has a long and proud industrial heritage. However, since the beginning of the 1980s, the British coal industry has lost over 250,000 jobs, which finally signalled the end, after decades of decline, of the industry across most of the country. Unemployment soared, and with it household incomes plummeted, taking with it aspirations and hope. The closure of the pits ripped the hearts out of the valley's communities and has left a scar that is still felt and seen today. Whereas prior to the global economic recession there had been some progress in generating new jobs in coalfield areas, former coal mining areas continue to suffer from a legacy of unemployment. Current statistics show many areas of the Neath constituency are well below the national average, whereas in Neath Talbot Local Authority, the Office for National Statistics rate of economic activity for working age people is 70.6% in the Dillais Valley. This falls to just 35%, which is more or less a third. Ill health is also part and parcel of this legacy, with residents of coalfield areas across the UK reporting double the levels of ill health or limitations on day-to-day activities as the more prosperous region of South East England, according to the Coalfields Regeneration Trust report on the state of the coalfields in 2014. Neath Talbot as a whole has the highest percentage of respiratory illness in Wales, the second highest incidence of strokes and diabetes, the third highest incidence of obesity, and the fifth highest death rate from chronic heart disease in Wales. As we know, there is a strong correlation between economic disadvantage and ill health, and this is clearly and very sadly reflected in my constituency. The combination of unemployment and poor health has led to a higher reliance on welfare benefits in many of our communities. We are faced with another blow, the impact of the 2012 Welfare Reform Act, and we are braced for a further 12 billion of cuts yet to come from the Conservative government, on which we are yet to see the fine detail. Although losses will widely vary depending on personal circumstances, it was estimated by the Welsh Government last year that the changes will constitute an annual loss of £500 per working age adult in Wales, and with Neath Talbot expected to be among the hardest hit in Wales, with losses closer to £600 per year per working age adult. Likewise, a report from Sheffield Hallam University in 2014 identified the South Wales valleys, with its higher proportion of people reliant on benefits, have been hit harder by the reforms than anywhere in Britain, with the valleys as a whole expected to lose around £430 million a year when the reforms have come to full fruition. These losses far exceed the flow of funding for economic development, which the area receives from sources like the European Union. Large reductions in income have an obvious knock-on effect on local consumer spending, straining local businesses and communities and supporting fewer jobs in the local economy, with ensuing detrimental effects on our communities, a vicious cycle. Spending cuts have also affected many voluntary and community organisations, as well as reducing the level of services delivered by local government. Critically, however, the Sheffield Hallam report did have some good news. In spite of the rather gloomy statistics, regeneration does work. And pre-recession, there was clearly progress being made in the UK's coalfield areas. Moreover, the report found that raising economic growth would deliver similar levels of savings to the UK Treasury, which is the impetus behind these Welsh welfare reforms. The anticipated savings to the Treasury of £1 billion a year, once the welfare reforms are implemented, could be made with the creation of 100,000 new jobs, which would both reduce the number of people reliant on benefits and provide higher tax revenues. Initially, the UK government's response to the collapse of the mining industry was very poor, with token gestures that had little impact. In Wales, it was really only from the late 1980s, with the launch of the Community Investment, an initiative for the valleys, and the establishment in 1989 of the European Regional Development Fund, alongside initiatives by the Welsh Development Agency, formed in 1976, when momentum began to bear fruit, accelerated since 1997 with the establishment of the Welsh Assembly Government, which now has responsibility for regeneration and development. Since then, UK, Welsh and European funding, working in partnership with the third sector, has supported a series of initiatives aimed at regeneration of the Welsh valleys, efforts rightly focused on retaining and developing skills for the workforce and on diversifying the economy beyond traditional industries. The Coalfield Regeneration Trust, created by the Labour government of 1997, is one organisation working in Wales since 1999 with the support of Welsh and local government funding, which has at its mission to champion coalfield communities, generating resources to respond to their needs and delivering programmes that make a positive and lasting difference. Over the last 14 years, it has invested over £14 million in community regeneration in Wales, working with and within the community. The partnerships between the EU and the Welsh Government has been critical in regenerating the Neath constituency. The European Regional Development Fund and the Welsh Government Regional Area Programme, plus contributions from Cadw and the Heritage Lottery, has funded the £9.2 million restoration of the Gwyn Hall in Neath Town Centre, which has re-established a centre for arts and culture in the locality, as well as providing much-needed employment. It has also funded the £1.4 million renovation of the Victoria Gardens, a beautiful historic green space in the town centre, which provides meeting and leisure opportunities for residents and visitors to relax. The redevelopment of Neath Town Centre itself will encompass new retail units, 600-space multi-storey car park and housing, including flats above shops, which will provide the necessary increase in footfall for the shops and businesses in the locality. In Neath, we have a very strong community spirit and social networks, but this is not enough. If we are going to solve the complex economic and social legacy that our coalfields communities have inherited, financial support and targeted measures are needed, and they must be designed in a collaborative spirit with the communities, not imposed. Organisations like the Bevan Foundation, an independent social justice think tank in Wales, and the Industrial Communities Alliance and others have looked closely at these complex issues and identified a number of important factors. Measures like low interest rates to encourage investment, rebalancing the economy towards industry in the region, a more measured approach to deficit reduction, investing in infrastructure such as strategic transport links and fast broadband, and job creation programmes, targeting those areas where it is needed greatest. Communities First, a Welsh Government programme, has invested in excess of £500 million in Wales's poorest communities, working with communities in the design, development and delivery of community regeneration programmes and job creation. And as already mentioned, key to our economic redevelopment has been European funding and its partnership with the Assembly in Wales, which has and is making a real difference locally and demonstrates why, for my constituents in Neath, continued membership of the EU is critical. It is through a collaborative, creative, constantly evolving and coordinated approach that it is possible to sow seeds of renewal and long-term recovery in our communities, and to move towards a new model which we can provide opportunities for everyone, creating the vibrant, viable communities that we all want and deserve. Thank you, Mr. Rosindell.
Toby Perkins.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Rosindell. Great pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, I think, for the first time. And I'd like to start by congratulating my honourable friend from Easington for securing this debate and for the contribution that he made in it, which was extensive, which was incredibly important. And I think, as he's heard from the other contributions in what has been a one-sided debate, that the issues that he's raising in his community are felt in many other communities across the older industrial areas. And so his contribution was a very important one. He quoted extensively from the Industrial Communities Alliance report, which was a very important piece of work and a very important organisation that makes sure that these issues are brought in front of government, and that government is forced to consider the legacy that exists in our older industrial areas, and cannot close its eyes to the poverty, deprivation that has been left as a result of the collapse, particularly of the mining industry, but also of the post-industrialisation and attack on the manufacturing sector that happened as other people reflected under the Conservative government between 1979 and 1997. So the work of the Industrial Communities Alliance is incredibly important, and he reflected their report very well in his contribution. He spoke on many occasions about the Northern Powerhouse and whether this was indeed a real thing or simply a chimera, an illusion, or possibly just a press release. And I think that he is potentially onto something there, because we have all seen over the course of the last few months the Chancellor suddenly discovering the North after many years of policies that have made life in northern communities very much more difficult. Huge cuts, of course, to local government in the North. A huge increase in inequality that we saw under the last government, and suddenly he arrived in his hard hat and his high visibility vest and announced that we had a Northern Powerhouse, or if not, he was going to create one. Of course, I'm happy to give way.
I'm grateful to my honourable friend on the front bench for giving way. I do think that this is a really important issue and worthy of the government's full attention, not just a photograph opportunity with a brightly coloured jacket pre-election. And as my honourable friends have already indicated, many of the problems faced by my area, coal closure area, are multifaceted. The legacy isn't just of joblessness. It's an environmental impact, it's derelict land, it's substandard former colliery housing, it's despoilation, it's a legacy of ill health. And it really needs a coordinated approach from government, beginning with the recognition of the particular problems, not just in coal mining areas, but in steel, textiles and many of the old industrial areas that face similar problems.
Well, I mean, I couldn't agree more, Mr. Rosindell, and the contribution he makes, I think, was speaking to many of the partnership approaches that were taking place under the last government. But these problems are complex. He's absolutely right to say that the combination of poverty, of historic benefit dependency, of ill health, both as a result of what people have put their bodies through working in industry, in heavy industry, and also the link, as other members referred to, between poverty and ill health more generally. So it does require a coordinated approach, and it does require a government that takes it seriously and considers that the regeneration of our industrial areas to be a real priority, and recognise that it's something that isn't easily resolved, isn't resolved with a press release or a photo opportunity, but requires substantial partnership work by all organisations, central, local government, the business community, the voluntary sector, the health authorities, working together on a cross agency approach over a very, very considerable period of time to alleviate that. And he will be aware that my own constituency of Chesterfield is a town featured in the Industrial Communities Alliance report, an area that had a significant history of coal mining, also had a substantial amount of manufacturing, much of which has now gone. We had Chesterfield was once a town in which 5 or 6 employers employed 3,000 or 4,000 people each, and now is a town where 3,000 or 4,000 employers employ 5 or 6 people each, and it's the changing face of our economy. But it poses very significant challenges to our economy and to the inequality question.
I'm grateful to my honourable friend for giving way, and just on that specific issue, I do take issue where you suggest that we had a historical long-term dependence on benefits. Easington had a historical long-term tradition of almost full employment when the pits were working. We're in this predicament at the moment because of the difficulty of attracting inward investment because of the complex nature of the problems, compounded by various aspects of government policy, including an announcement this week of a £200 million cut in public health funding, of which £3.5 million will be cut from Durham County Council's budgets, and that enables addressing some of the long-term issues of ill health, of poor diet, in some of the poorest communities. So the government needs to end this short-term approach, take a long-term coordinated approach to the problems in Chesterfield, in Easington, in Neath, in Sheffield, in Glasgow, and all those older industrial areas.
Well, I certainly agree, Mr. Rosindell. And what I'm referring to is what actually happened in these areas post the closure of the coal mines, particularly, and the manufacturing sector. And what's been a real irony about the government's approach to welfare and to sort of suggesting that there's this group of people who wanted to live on welfare that was precisely what Mrs Thatcher's approach was when she shut all the pits, which she went to all these people, shut entire communities down, threw a whole community out of work, put huge numbers of people onto incapacity benefit and parked them there for a very long period of time indeed. So in so much as there was a history of welfare dependency, it was Mrs Thatcher that caused it. And he's right to clarify that point. He spoke also about the local enterprise partnerships, and I'll speak in more detail about the role that local enterprise partnerships and previously the Regional Development Agency could play, and also ways in which maybe the decisions taken by the government have prevented them being as effective as they could have been, particularly at a time when it was their help was really needed. There were a couple of issues that he raised that I wanted to explore and respond to. One of them was about the increase in self-employment, and he was talking about the insecurity that goes with that. As someone who was self-employed for 6 years myself prior to coming into Parliament, it certainly is an insecure line of work, but it is something in itself that should be encouraging. Self-employment's a great thing. I think we need to simultaneously recognise that some people go into setting up their own businesses as a result of there being no other options, and sometimes it is a sign of the weakness of the local economy, and other times it's something to be welcomed. But the recognition of that insecurity of the workplace is an important one. But I think he's also potentially referring to the amount of bogus self-employment, the number of people who would, to the majority of us, appear to be employed, but are actually in insecure situations where they appear to be, or where they're classed as self-employed, but actually effectively are employed. I'll give way again.
I'm grateful, my honourable friend's being very generous, but I think it is important to challenge the accepted logic that an increase in self-employment is necessarily a good thing. I think we need to look at where it is, and Certainly I know the construction union, UCAT, and other trade unions who organise in the construction sector are really concerned about the increase in casualisation, the use of umbrella companies, where it's being used as a mechanism by some unscrupulous employers to increase job security, to drive down the terms and wages and conditions of the workforce on building sites. And there are other examples like that. I know there are a number of people who were directly employed in the offshore industry who are now classed as self-employed, not because they have chosen to do that, but they've been forced into that route. So it doesn't necessarily indicate that it's a positive thing for the local economy, although I accept we want to encourage small businesses to grow and to take on employment, but that doesn't necessarily translate in the figures that are being quoted about the growth in self-employment in areas like mine.
Well, it certainly is a multitudinous issue. I feel I've been responding to his speech longer than he actually gave it, so I'm going to move on slightly. But as he rightly says, we have got a bit of time. But there were other important contributions made. The Honourable Lady from Glasgow Central reflected on the extent to which the industrial jobs have gone in her constituency. And she is in a city, as my honourable friend from Sheffield Heeley, who have seen huge amounts of regeneration, huge amounts of positive things happening in the city, but also still that legacy exists from the older industrial decline of those older industrial communities and ways of working. And I thought when listening to the Honourable Lady from Glasgow Central, how similar many of the experiences she had and her constituency had with other contributions that were made. And I reflected that hearing honourable members from Glasgow and from Sheffield reflecting on the challenges to their cities, and then hearing from honourable friends from Easington and Neath about the impact on former mining communities, as I reflect here in Chesterfield. That actually there is a lot more that links us across England, Scotland and Wales in those industrial areas than divides us, and it's probably something for us to consider as we think more broadly about the direction that our country is going, that there are huge numbers of these things that affect us all, that are shared experiences that we've had, that are new opportunities that we have, but also are painful legacies that we have endured and shared together. My honourable friend from Sheffield Hallam also said that the legacy of Mrs Thatcher had cast a dark shadow over the older industrial areas and reflected the importance of rebalancing our economy. And my honourable friend from Neath said that the scar of mining closures were still felt today and spoke powerfully on the impact of ill health and the link between ill health and poverty. And she also made the point, which I think was a very important one, about the impact of spending cuts on local government and then the knock-on impact that has on the voluntary sector, because we all know that over the course of many years under the Labour government, the voluntary sector was incredibly powerful and important in terms of the regeneration approach. And ironically, a government that came to power promising us the big society and this revolution in the voluntary sector have actually achieved the absolute opposite. And we know we have a very much weakened voluntary sector, which is unable to pick up the pieces in many of the ways that it has done previously. And we know that many of the issues that were raised in this report, complex and long-standing as they are, were being addressed under the previous government. We had seen huge regeneration of our great cities. In my own area, Junction 29A, new junction on the motorway, referred to still today as Skinner's Junction because of the campaigning that my honourable friend from Bolsover did to bring it there, with a huge new industrial estate next to it. And in reading the Industrial Communities Alliance report, 4,900 extra jobs in Bolsover, one of the most successful of the areas in the older industrial areas in terms of employment growth, precisely because the Labour government had made the decision to actually invest in those communities. And it shows that actually if you make that investment, you can actually get real results. The Coalfield Regeneration Trust did so much work and were supported so strongly by the previous Labour government. And the Honourable Gentleman raised the point of health promotion, because the previous government had made huge investments in health promotion, recognising the massive challenges that face these communities. We've seen just recently the £200 million cut in health promotion, which I think will have very significant impacts. So I think the contributions made by honourable members and my honourable friends were very powerful ones and really expressed the importance of this. In terms of earned income, the United Kingdom is the fourth most unequal country in the OECD. Just out of 30 countries, only the USA, Israel and Mexico are more unequal than we are here. And so my honourable friend from Doncaster North was absolutely right to say inequality is one of the challenges, one of the really huge challenges that faces not just our country but the world, but specifically our country. And it's something the Labour Party will be giving a considerable amount of thought to over the course of the next 5 years as we attempt to put together a programme that can win the support of the British people again. The income is also spread unequally across the UK's regions and nations. The average household income in London massively higher than that in the North East. In addition to income, overall wealth is also unevenly spread across the UK. The average household in the South East has almost twice the amount of wealth of an average household in Scotland. And different regions of the country have a different percentage share of UK gross disposable household income. In London and the South East, over 32% overall gross disposable income. In the North East, just 3.5%. So those disparities exist. I think it is important to recognise that poverty isn't the preserve of the North. There are parts right across our country that face really substantial challenges. Cornwall, which you may well have expected might have been represented today, but is an area that has huge challenges. But nonetheless, there is a specific challenge facing the older industrial areas, and it is important to reflect that. Now, in many members raised issues as to why we are in the position that we're in, and I think there are 3 or 4 really key challenges and key reasons why that is. The first is the failure to invest in retraining and vocational skills for the forgotten 50% has left people in the older industrial areas vulnerable for falling into a life of low pay. In the UK today, far too many people do a hard day's work but are living in poverty and visiting the food bank on the way home. And the Prime Minister continually tells us that a job is the route out of poverty, but actually what we're seeing is that increasingly people in poverty are also in work, and that work under the government no longer pays in a way that enables people to have the dignity of being able to feed their family alone. Over 5 million people now in low-paid jobs, and more than 250,000 people estimated to earn less than the national minimum wage. And the problem of low pay has got significantly worse under this government. Not only has the national minimum wage fallen in real terms since 2010, but the official figures show that without action to take low wages, spending on tax credits for people in work is set to rise by an estimated £2.5 billion over the course of this Parliament. And only this government could think that the response to the low-pay environment that we have, to all these people who go to work, who work hard all week, and still don't have enough money at the end of the week to put food on the table for kids, only this government could think the response to that is to cut tax credits. What an appalling legacy that this government will be leaving of that increase in child poverty. And we're hearing already that this government are thinking of repealing the Child Poverty Act so that they no longer get held to account for the increase in child poverty that we've seen under them. But all around our communities, all around our countries, there are people sitting around the kitchen table knowing the reality of what life under this government has really looked like. We also have seen a huge increase in the productivity gap. Professor Van Reenen, the head of the Centre for Economic Performance at the LSE, said by Thursday lunchtime, other major countries in Europe have produced as much as it takes us to produce by Friday afternoon. Basically, an English worker could take every Friday off if we could be as productive as those other countries and earn the same amount of money. So there's a real challenge in terms of productivity, which is partly linked to lack of investment and short-termism that some other colleagues raised. For too long, the British economy has taken a short-term approach to matters of research and development. Far fewer people involved in R&D in this country than in many of our European competitors. And likewise, while we waited an age for a final decision on the new runway for London, Charles de Gaulle Airport outside Paris has had 4 runways for years. So there is many reasons why these endemic challenges that face us in the older industrial areas have not been addressed. The government are also exacerbating the problems. The policies of a truly one-nation government would help to overcome these regional disparities. But spending on infrastructure, as my honourable friend reflected, really seeks to increase that disparity that exists. London gets 24 times as much per head spent on it than on the northeast of England. My honourable friends quoted statistics that I also have here, but bear repeating. That the amount spent on Crossrail alone outweighs that spent 9 times more than that earmarked for rail projects in the whole of Yorkshire, the North East and North West. There's also a very substantial gap in the ability of businesses in older industrial areas to access finance. So there is a much less competitive access to finance market there. And as a result, the amount of money both that is lent by banking sector to our businesses is very substantially different depending on where it was. £2,647 was lent to businesses per head of population in London. Less than half of that was led to businesses in the North East or the East Midlands. And entrepreneurs in areas with huge potential for growth are crying out for the support, but finding that unless you live in an area that's already coping better than with the post-crash world than most, the government's door is shut to them. And my honourable friend referred to the closure of One North East and the ineffectiveness in his case in the local enterprise partnerships. I have to say that many of the local enterprise partnerships are working hard to try and make a contribution. But it was a very strange decision at a time when the economy was desperate for growth. In fact, we already had growth, we should remember, in 2010 at the end of the last government. But it was a very strange decision at a time when we still needed a great deal more growth for the government to shut the regional development agencies and then set up these fledgling organisations with very, very limited resources and a very unclear role, which they have all attempted to the best of their ability to find a role, but they have been inconsistent, and the ability with which they've been able to provide that role has been very, very different. And only now, I think some of them are starting to come to fruition 5 years after they were desperately needed. So I think that was another measure that the government took that had a very negative impact. Strengthening local enterprise partnerships so that they are able to provide a greater capacity and stronger services is a very important part of the solution, as is strengthening local authorities. Welcome steps to strengthen the combined authority in Greater Manchester. We want to see more combined authorities to tackle the chronic problems of poor skills, infrastructure and economic development. We need to see reform of our business rate system, which has worked very much against business development in older industrial areas. If we had had the business rate re-evaluation that was cancelled by the last government, business rate bills for people in my honourable friend's constituency would be hundreds, if not thousands of pounds lower, and business rate bills in central London would be higher. So that you would have that impact that would have made a big difference to our local communities. But we also believe that local areas and local authorities should be supported where they are having success in attracting and supporting businesses by retaining more of the business rate revenue generated by growth to invest in building further success. And we also need to see a greater decentralisation of government infrastructure so that more government money is being spent in the older industrial areas. So a government with a commitment to a high wage, high skilled workforce, devolution to English city and county regions that put local councils at the heart of building up the older industrial areas, dealing with the huge increase in productivity fall that we've seen under this government, and access to finance system that really sees money going to businesses in our older industrial areas, expanding the capacity and strength of the local enterprise partnerships and fair funding for local authorities in the poorest areas, and a reform of business rates that really supports small businesses in our communities. That's the kind of programme that will actually start to support and improve our older industrial areas. This debate has been an important one, putting these issues in front of the government, but we need the government to stop with the rhetoric and to start with the action. If we do that, we might actually see our communities getting the kind of support they deserve.
Anna Soubry.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr Rosindell, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. I think it's a first for both of us. And if it's not, then I apologise. It's a pleasure to serve yet again under your chairmanship. Can I obviously begin by congratulating the Honourable Gentleman for securing this debate. It's an important debate on economic disparities in the older industrial areas. And can I make it clear from the outset that the government's economic ambition is to create a fairer and more balanced economy by supporting policies that grow the economy as a whole and generate new jobs and higher wages for everybody. Mr Rosindell, it's been an interesting debate. I have to confess that at times I thought I'd stepped back in history and had returned to my old student union days back in the 1970s. When I was listening to some of the speeches of honourable members opposite, I am slightly concerned, if I may say, about the memory of some of my honourable friends who in one moment hadn't even finished this particular insult. But if I may say, I think with few exceptions, they all seem to have completely forgotten that for some 13 years we had a Labour government. And if these ideas and if these complaints that they now make are to have been valid, you might have thought that in the course of that 13 years of Labour government, they would have put many of these things right. Indeed, they didn't. And in fact, it was the case that because of the very policies of that Labour government, notably towards the end, a government that failed to save and fix the roof when the sun was shining, a government that continued, as it now some recognise, to overspend, when the economy in the world had suffered the crash it did, the policies of that Labour government exacerbated things and made things worse. And if I may say, and I will obviously take the intervention, if I may, give some advice to honourable members. If they don't learn from the experience of what happened in May, they'll be out of office for not just 5, but for a generation to come. And of course, I'll give way.
I'm grateful to the Minister, and I'm familiar with the standard response and the figures and Labour's to blame and so on. But my job as the Labour MP for Easington is to hold the government to account.
Quite.
And with some specific suggestions that would help my area and indeed the areas represented by my honourable friends who are suffering similar problems. So, for example, the government's policy in relation to FE college funding, which has had a huge negative impact on the East Durham College because it's concentrating just on apprenticeship training for young people. It does not provide funding for older workers to retrain. That there are some specific proposals that are identified in this report, and without being disrespectful, rather than have a lecture about what happened 13 years ago, if we could address the issues in the report that we raised in the debate, that would be really helpful.
Of course, as you might expect, Mr Rosindell, I'm going to deal in some detail with the situation in the Honourable Gentleman's constituency and indeed the situation in the constituencies of all those that have spoken, with the exception of my friend, the member for Chesterfield, and I'm more than happy to write to him to tell him about the advances that have been made in the last 5 years in Chesterfield. But the reason I say that is to put this into some sort of context, because I too have had to sit, not just listening to a lecture, but a rewriting of history that even the most read of historians would struggle to write. But Mr Rosindell, if I may, I'd like to talk about the Industrial Communities Alliance report. Since the beginning of the 1970s, UK cities have experienced an ongoing historic shift in economic orientation, driven on the one hand by the process of sustained deindustrialisation, as we have heard about, and on the other by a progressive rise in service and what we call tertiary activity. The report focuses on old industrial centres that have been slower to replace declining industries. Previously, industrial centres that have moved on, such as London, and we often forget that London used to be a heavily industrial city, but that city moved on. but they don't obviously appear in the list. Therein lies an important point. There's nothing preordained about past or current trends continuing into the future. In fact, over the past 3 decades, some cities have experienced positive shifts of direction or positive turnarounds in their differential growth paths. Oxford is an example, it's Brighton, Ipswich, and as I say, London. And of course, I recognise, and I'm a Midlands, East Midlands MP, as indeed the Honourable Member for Chesterfield is, and I recognise that those cities are in the south of England. And much will depend on how different older industrial centres are able to attract and develop the growth sectors of the future. Can I turn now to the economy in 1 moment? I'm going to turn to the economy in Easington, because it was the honourable gentleman who is a champion for his constituency who talked about Easington. We've all witnessed tremendous technological changes in our lifetimes. And I'm old enough, certainly, to say that, especially given that I come from North Nottinghamshire and the town of Worksop, where there was a coal mine, which was pretty much where the whole town depended on the success or otherwise of the Manton Colliery and indeed the surrounding collieries. So I'm well familiar with pits. But industries that didn't exist 20 years ago are now the most productive in the world. Within the honourable gentleman's own constituency, this change has been more apparent than most. Since the closure of the dominant coal mine in 1993, the area has undergone a tremendous change. The legacy of coal mining is still being dealt with, but great progress has been made in remediating the industrial pollution, for example. The Durham coast, as the honourable gentleman has told us, is now home to one of the most stunning coastal walks in the United Kingdom, with the Durham Heritage Coast highlighting the great natural, historical and geological interest of the area, with dramatic views along the coastline and out across the North Sea, framed by magnesium limestone cliffs. It's an area I haven't been to, and I would love to go to the honourable gentleman's constituency, and I hope to arrange that visit. A former slag heap is now the site of one of the country's most dynamic retail centres, with more expansion about to start at Dalton Park. I was reminded by my officials who provided me with a note about the Regional Growth Fund's investment in Easington, and it might have been thought from the speech that the honourable gentleman gave that there had been no investment in his constituency. On the contrary, there are currently 8 projects in Easington, which have been awarded a total of £13.4 million, and which are contracted to lever a further £81.6 million of private sector investment, and they are contracted to create or safeguard 1,189 jobs. I would hope the honourable gentleman will welcome this great investment of taxpayers' money.
Excellent brief and the description of the East Durham Heritage Coast, which is absolutely perfect. I can't fault that. The problem that we've got, Minister, is we're not able to access it because of the lack of transport infrastructure and the lack of railway halts. On the issue of the Regional Growth Fund awards, much of that is linked to the automotive supply chain, so it does cause considerable concern when there are doubts about our continued membership of the EU. But yes, I think they are positive things in relation to support for businesses. My concern was that it wasn't as comprehensive as the support, the expertise given by One North East, and the reorganisation, as always happens, whether it's local government or health, caused a huge hiatus and a delay in taking forward investment projects that would have benefited the area considerably.
Well, I'm not sure if the honourable gentleman is saying that this is considerable and great investment in his constituency. I've read out the figures; they are substantial. And as I've said, this money is part of a contract, so it is reliant on securing these features as I've identified. I'm more than happy to respond to what he's said to me in more detail by way of letter, and indeed to meet him. And I also would like to meet his local enterprise partnership. So I strongly suspect that they may have a rather different view of the situation in his area than the one that he has given us today. But these projects include, for example, NSK Bearings Limited, who were awarded £3.45 million in round 3 to assist with business expansion. And that the award by the Regional Growth Fund was part of a £19.9 million investment which helped to safeguard 265 jobs. Again, something that I hope the honourable gentleman would welcome. And it's also to be noted that unemployment in his constituency continues to fall. 6,400 more people in work today than in 2010. Those people are people who would otherwise be at home and on benefit, and are now having the benefit of a job. And I find it difficult for honourable members not to welcome when people go into the world of work. Surely it must be better to be in a job than to be sat at home on the dole. Mr Rosindell, could I just very briefly deal with the Northern Powerhouse? I think the honourable gentleman for Chesterfield seems to have forgotten that the Chancellor actually has represented a northern constituency in Chesterfield, in Cheshire for many years. So the idea that he's in some way new to the north of our country is complete nonsense. He's represented, I think it's Tatton, for a number of years. And the other feature of the Northern Powerhouse is that this is not something that's been imposed on Northern Council. On the contrary, councils of all political persuasions, and I give them full credit, especially Labour-run councils in Liverpool and in Manchester, have absolutely not just triumphed this and trumpeted it, but they have led the way on the creation of this Northern Powerhouse. So I really am concerned that it seems to be the case that honourable members sitting in this place don't seem to be supporting their fellow colleagues in these great councils who've come together and are championing and taking through the Northern Powerhouse. Of course I'll give way.
I am grateful to the honourable lady. Colleagues on our side of the House are, of course, in favour of the Northern Powerhouse, and we welcome discussions around devolution. But those discussions have to come with resources and investment to the North as well. And does the Minister not see how we are sceptical about the Northern Powerhouse when decisions like today are announced that have completely scrapped investment into electrification of the route from London to Sheffield?
Well, can I just correct the honourable lady and say that she said it had been scrapped, and she said the electrification of the Midland Main Line had been abandoned, and she's wrong. She's absolutely wrong. I don't know if she... There's no point shaking the honourable lady shaking her head. I was in the chamber when the Secretary of State for Transport made his announcement. I don't know whether she was, but I was. And I heard exactly what he said. This process has been paused, it has been put on hold because of problems and failings in Network Rail. It has not been scrapped and it has not been abandoned. And I would remind the honourable lady that in 13 years of her government, 10 miles was electrified of rail in this country. And the investment, which we have not turned our back on, almost £40 billion of improvement in railways, will continue. And as somebody who travels on the Midland Main Line, as she does, and my constituency, the station of Beeston, lies upon the railway line, I can assure her that the improvements that will be made to it will mean that there'll be 6 more trains leaving St Pancras an hour than 5 as there are at the moment. So I'm afraid she's misleading people and her constituents if she says this has been abandoned or it has been scrapped. It hasn't. Yes, of course.
I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady for giving way on the subject of misleading constituents, because the Honourable Lady was representative of a marginal East Midlands town, and up until just a few weeks ago, when this election took place, all of her constituents believed this government were delivering electrification of the Midland Main Line. And the truth of the matter is that as soon as the election's over, they come up here and say, oh, actually, by the way, we're not going ahead with it. Now, whether it's a pause or whether it ever happens, but she ought to be careful she starts accusing other people of misleading their constituents.
Well, Mr Rosindell, this is not the debate that we're meant to be having. I sat in the chamber. I heard what the Secretary of State said. He made it very clear that it's not been abandoned. It's not been scrapped. He deliberately used the word pause. No point heckling from a sedentary position. It doesn't advance the debate at all. And I don't think it actually addresses the honourable member for Easington's complaints and his concerns for his constituents either. Made it very clear it's been paused for good reason because of the failings of Network Rail, and the improvements to the rest of the line will certainly continue. Mr Rosindell, can I return as I have said I would like to the Honourable Gentleman for Easington's constituency and the wider North East becoming a place where a new economy is beginning to grow. In Peterlee alone, Caterpillar employs 1,000 people and is a global centre for research and development and production of Caterpillar's articulated truck range. Caterpillar is one of the United Kingdom's largest heavy equipment manufacturers, with annual exports worth over £1.5 billion, and some 85% of the United Kingdom's production of construction equipment is for export. That is something certainly to be championed in this place by the Honourable Gentleman. Nissan's Sunderland plant secured £250 million of investment to manufacture the Infiniti Q30, creating up to 1,000 new jobs, 300 of which are being recruited now. And this is the first new volume manufactured brand in the United Kingdom for over 20 years, and production starts later this year. And I'm often reminded that, of course, more cars are now being produced in Sunderland than in the whole of Italy. The Sunderland plant currently employs just under 7,000 people over 2 lines on and produced just over 500,000 cars in 2014, the equivalent of 1 in 3 of all cars made in the United Kingdom. The northern powerhouse regions, that's the North East, the North West, Yorkshire and the Humber, account for 25% of the UK's automotive sector, and the work by the newly created North East Automotive Alliance should build on this strength. Turning to science and innovation, they too play a considerable part. Net Park in Sedgefield provides an outstanding example of how world-class science and innovation is partnered with great facilities and businesses support to continue their significant growth. It's now a very significant employment site with plans to expand to over 3,000 jobs in the next 10 years. And just last week, Net Park announced that they have nearly 160 active collaborations with universities, illustrating its existing global position and helping translate first-class research into products that have real social impact, which create jobs and prosperity. The government recognises the continuing historic challenges facing the local economy in Easington. There are similar challenges facing many former industrial communities across England, but the solutions to these challenges are not the same. A one-size-fits-all solution from Whitehall will not work. For Britain to prosper, every part of the country needs to fulfil its potential. And that is why, Mr Rosindell, this government has been so committed to the devolving out of power, not just to the northern powerhouse, but to great cities like Sheffield, where we see again the number of people in jobs rising by some 700, where we see 2 outstanding universities, where we see £11 million of technical incubators. These are just some of the great things that are happening in a city like Sheffield, where we see £23.8 million of funding going into skills, with 4,000 apprenticeships to be created by 2016. None of these factors, of course, were raised, unfortunately, in the speech given by the Honourable Lady who represents Sheffield Heeley. I have some details about the city deal in Glasgow to reply to the Honourable Member for Glasgow Central. I will write to the Honourable Lady who represents Neath about the investment that this government is making in her constituency and indeed in her part of Wales as well. But in short, because I think I have to finish at 3 o'clock, Mr. Rosindell.
The Minister may be aware that the proposer of the debate wishes to have a short summing up period, so if she could
bring my comments to a close. I will. And Mr Rosindell, can I thank you for that? And also to say, of course, I will write to the Honourable Gentleman with all the other statistics and facts that I have, not only about Easington, but also his part of the North East. But he and other Honourable Members can be absolutely assured that because of the long-term economic plan of this government, which has already proved to be so successful in growing our economy and creating jobs, which Honourable Members often, in my view, too often sneer at instead of praising, can be assured that it won't just be in the south that success and growth will continue, but absolutely go throughout the country, right into the northern powerhouse, which includes the North East and, of course, the constituency of the Honourable Gentleman.
Graham Morris.
Grateful. Thank you, Mr. Rosindell, and can I thank the Minister for responding, although perhaps I would take issue with her geography and a number of the points that she made in response. But could I thank all of the members who've participated in the debate, and could I particularly thank the Honourable Member for Glasgow Central, my Honourable friend the Member for Sheffield Heeley, and my Honourable friend the Member for Neath, and my Honourable friend the Member for Chesterfield, for their contributions, highlighting some really important issues about contaminated land, the need to address skill shortages, issues around industrial decline, the need for diversity, to have a multi-agency approach, the importance of European funding, and the importance of our membership, particularly in relation to the European Union in relation to the automotive supply chain. There are many, many issues that require a coordinated approach from government, and I do hope the Minister will reflect on the report and the representations from the Industrial Communities Alliance and come forward with some solid, positive proposals that will benefit areas like Easington, like Wales, Scotland and the other older industrial areas that really need some impetus and some initiative from government. Thank you.
Order, order.